Did you already choose the nursing home, or are you still deciding how to get rid of me? I asked quietly, my voice steady enough to surprise even myself. My son froze mid-step, his hand still resting on the back of the chair, while my daughter-in-law slowly turned toward me, her smile thin and practiced, as if this were just another polite family discussion instead of what it really was. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from, because what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about my own family. It was a warm Tuesday afternoon in early spring, the kind of day where sunlight spills gently through the windows and makes everything look softer than it really is. I had spent the morning in my kitchen, the same kitchen I had stood in for over 35 years, brewing coffee and straightening things that didn't need straightening, trying to ignore the quiet that had settled into the house ever since my husband passed 6 months ago. The clock on the wall ticked louder these days. Every sound did. When Daniel, my only son, called the night before and said he wanted to talk about something important, I told myself not to worry. Families talk. That's what we do. But when he arrived that afternoon with his wife, Melissa, and a man in a gray suit I had never seen before, something inside me shifted. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was something colder. Something that whispered that I was about to be asked to give up more than just my independence. We sat at the dining table, my table, and the man introduced himself as a senior living consultant, his tone smooth, rehearsed. Melissa reached across and placed a glossy brochure in front of me, filled with pictures of smiling elderly people playing bingo and tending gardens that didn't belong to them. It's time to think about what's best for you, she said gently, too gently, like she was speaking to a child. Daniel didn't meet my eyes. He just nodded. And in that moment, staring at the carefully staged photos of strangers living out their final years in quiet obedience, I realized something that made my chest tighten, not because I was afraid of where they wanted to send me, but because I finally understood why. The brochure stayed in front of me long after they finished talking, its glossy pages catching the afternoon light like it was trying too hard to look inviting. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. I had already seen enough in Melissa's careful smile and Daniel's silence to understand what this really was. For the past 6 months, ever since my husband Harold passed, my world had grown quieter, smaller, but never once had I felt incapable. I still woke up at 6 a.m. every morning, made my coffee the same way Harold liked it, even though I was the only one drinking it now. I paid my bills on time, balanced my checkbook down to the last dollar, and kept the house exactly as it had always been, clean, warm, and lived in. But somewhere along the way, without saying it out loud, they had started seeing me differently. Not as a mother. Not as the woman who raised Daniel on her own for years while Harold worked double shifts. But as something else. Something fragile. Something inconvenient. It's not about you not being able to take care of yourself, Daniel finally said, his voice low, almost rehearsed, like he'd practiced it in the car before coming in. It's just, this house is a lot. And those places, they have people around, activities, medical staff if you need it. I nodded slowly, as if I were considering it, but inside, something was quietly rearranging itself. Because what he didn't say mattered more than what he did. He didn't mention the property taxes I'd never once missed. He didn't mention the fact that this house, this very house, was fully paid off. And he definitely didn't mention the conversations I had started noticing over the past few weeks. The hushed phone calls. The way Melissa would lower her voice when I walked into the room during their last visit. The time I caught a glimpse of my bank statements on Daniel's phone screen, statements I never sent him. At the time, I told myself I was imagining things. That grief was making me suspicious. But sitting there now, with that brochure between us like a quiet contract waiting to be signed, I realized something that made my stomach turn. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't concern. This was a plan. And I had been the only one who didn't know I was part of it. Melissa was the one who broke the silence first, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of the brochure as if she were guiding the conversation back on track. We actually toured this place last week, she said, her voice warm in a way that didn't reach her eyes. It's beautiful, really. They have a garden, a fitness room, even weekly outings. You wouldn't be alone there. Alone. The word lingered in the air longer than it should have. I almost smiled at that, because I hadn't felt truly alone until that very moment, sitting across from my own family and realizing they had already made a decision about my life without me. Daniel finally pulled out a folder from his bag, sliding it across the table toward me with careful precision. There's just some paperwork, he said. Nothing complicated. Just to get things started. I didn't open it. Instead, I rested my hand gently on top of it, feeling the weight of it, not just the paper, but everything behind it. What exactly are we starting, Daniel? I asked, keeping my tone soft, almost curious. He hesitated. Just for a second. But I saw it. That flicker. That tiny crack in the confidence they had walked in with. Melissa stepped in before he could answer. It's just a transition plan, she said quickly. We want to make sure everything is handled smoothly. The house, your accounts, your care, my accounts. There it was again. Not concern. Not care. Control. I leaned back slightly in my chair, studying them both now the way I used to study Daniel when he was a boy trying to hide something behind his back. The signs were all there if you knew how to look. The way he avoided my eyes. The way Melissa spoke for him. The way everything had already been arranged before I even knew there was a conversation to be had. And then, without meaning to, my mind drifted back to 3 weeks ago, the afternoon I stopped by the bank to deposit a check. It had been an ordinary errand. Routine. But I remembered the teller hesitating when she pulled up my account, her polite smile tightening just slightly. We've had a few recent inquiries about your account, she had said. From a Daniel Carter? At the time, I laughed it off. Of course my son would be checking in, making sure everything was fine. That's what good sons do. But now, sitting here with a folder full of papers I hadn't asked for and a future I hadn't agreed to, that memory didn't feel harmless anymore. It felt like the first loose thread in something much bigger. And for the first time since Harold passed, I didn't feel grief sitting in my chest. I felt something else. Something colder. Clearer. I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't imagining things. They weren't here to help me. They were here to move me. And more importantly, to move everything I had out of my control. I didn't say anything right away. I just nodded, like a mother listening to her children explain something they believed made perfect sense. Because the truth was, I had spent most of my life listening before speaking. It was how I survived raising a family, how I kept peace in a home where money was tight and emotions ran high. But as I sat there, watching Melissa carefully stack the papers and Daniel shift in his seat, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding I could smooth over. This was something that had been building quietly, piece by piece, while I was still holding on to the version of my family that no longer existed. My eyes drifted past them, settling on the window above the sink, where the late afternoon light stretched across the backyard Harold and I had planted together more than 30 years ago. I could still see him out there in my mind, sleeves rolled up, dirt on his hands, telling me this house would always be mine, no matter what happened. No one will ever take this away from you, he used to say. At the time, I believed him without question. And maybe that was my mistake, not trusting him, but believing that promise would be respected by the people we raised. Mom? Daniel's voice pulled me back. We just want what's best for you. I looked at him then, really looked at him, searching for the boy who used to run into my arms after school, who once told me I was the strongest person he knew. He was still there, somewhere behind the hesitation and the influence that now stood beside him. But he wasn't leading anymore. Melissa was. And she knew it. Of course you do, I said softly, letting just enough warmth stay in my voice to keep them comfortable. And I appreciate that. That seemed to relax them. I could see it in the way Melissa's shoulders lowered slightly, in the way Daniel finally met my eyes for a brief moment, relieved that I wasn't pushing back. They thought I was agreeing. They thought this would be easy. That I would sign whatever they placed in front of me, pack up a lifetime into boxes, and quietly step out of the way. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that something had already shifted inside me. Because that moment at the bank 3 weeks ago hadn't ended with a simple deposit. It had stayed with me. The hesitation in the teller's voice. The mention of inquiries. It didn't sit right, no matter how many times I tried to dismiss it. So 2 days later, I went back. Not to deposit anything. Just to ask questions. And that was when everything started to change. The second time I walked into the bank, I didn't mention Daniel's name right away. I just smiled at the same young teller and asked if I could speak with someone about my account, just to review a few things. My voice was calm, steady, the same voice I had used for years handling bills, insurance, everything Harold used to trust me with. They led me into a small office, quiet and neatly arranged, where a woman named Patricia introduced herself as the branch manager. She had kind eyes, but more importantly, she had the kind of attention that told me she was actually listening. I closed the door behind me and sat down, folding my hands in my lap so she wouldn't see the slight tremble in them. "I'd like to know who has been accessing my account," I said simply. No drama. No accusations. Just facts. Patricia hesitated, not in a suspicious way, but in the careful, professional way of someone who understood that what she was about to say mattered. She turned her screen slightly, reviewing something, then looked back at me. "There have been several inquiries over the past month," she confirmed. "Not transactions, but requests. For information. Balance checks, asset summaries, things like that." My chest tightened, but I kept my face still. "And who made those requests?" I asked. She paused again, then said it gently, like she was placing something fragile on the table between us. "Your son, Daniel Carter. He's listed as an emergency contact, but not as an authorized user." That distinction landed harder than anything else. Not authorized. Which meant he had been asking without permission. Not helping, probing. I nodded slowly, as if I had expected it all along. "Can that information be accessed without my consent?" I asked. Patricia shook her head. "Not officially. But sometimes, family members call, ask questions, try to gather details. We don't disclose anything sensitive, but even general confirmations can be revealing." Revealing. That was the word. Because suddenly, all those small moments over the past few weeks started lining up. The way Melissa casually mentioned managing finances during her last visit. The way Daniel asked if I'd consider downsizing even before today. They weren't guessing. They were gathering. Preparing. I sat there for another minute, letting the silence settle, feeling something inside me shift into place, not fear, not even anger, but clarity. "I'd like to make some changes," I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. Patricia nodded immediately, reaching for a form. "Of course. What kind of changes?" I looked at her, then down at my hands, then back up again. And in that moment, I made the first decision that truly belonged to me in a long time. "I want to ensure that everything I've built goes exactly where I choose," I said. "And nowhere else." Patricia didn't rush me. She turned her monitor fully toward me this time, explaining each option in a clear, measured voice, but I barely needed the details. I already knew what I was going to do. "I want to remove any informal access," I said. "No more inquiries. No discussions with anyone unless I'm physically present." She nodded, typing quickly. "We can flag your account for that," she replied. "And I would also recommend updating your beneficiaries and setting up a trust if you haven't already." A trust. The word lingered in my mind longer than anything else she said. Harold and I had talked about it years ago, but we never thought we needed it. Back then, everything felt simple. Family meant trust. Trust meant safety. But sitting in that quiet office, I realized how outdated that thinking had become. "Let's do that," I said. "All of it." The next hour passed in a calm, almost clinical rhythm of forms, signatures, confirmations, but underneath it, something far more important was happening. I wasn't just adjusting paperwork. I was taking control back, piece by piece. Patricia helped me contact an estate attorney they worked with regularly, a man named Mr. Klein, who joined us later that afternoon by phone. His voice was direct, respectful, the kind of voice that didn't waste time but didn't make you feel rushed either. He asked me simple questions: what I owned, who I trusted, what I wanted my legacy to look like. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, I answered without hesitation. "I have one daughter," I said. "Emily. We haven't been as close these past few years, but she's honest. She's steady. She's never once asked me for anything I didn't offer." There was a pause on the line, then a quiet acknowledgement. "That matters," he said. It did. More than anything. Because as I sat there, thinking about Daniel and the way he had avoided my eyes, I understood something that hurt more than I expected. It wasn't just that he wanted control. It was that he assumed I wouldn't notice. That I would simply follow along. "I want the trust placed in Emily's name," I continued, my voice steady. 500,000. Effective immediately. Patricia glanced up at me, just briefly, and I could tell she understood the weight of what I was doing. This wasn't a reaction. This was a decision. A line drawn quietly, but firmly. "We can have that processed within 24 hours, she said. I nodded once. Good. And as I signed the final document, my hand no longer trembling, I felt something settle deep inside me. Not relief. Not yet. But certainty. Because whatever Daniel and Melissa thought they were walking into the next day, they were already too late. When I walked out of the bank that afternoon, the world didn't look any different, but I did. The sky was still that same soft blue, the parking lot still half full, the wind still carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass from somewhere nearby. But something inside me had gone quiet in a way it hadn't been for months. Not empty. Not broken. Just still. Like the moment after a storm passes and everything settles into place. I drove home slowly, hands steady on the wheel, replaying every word Daniel and Melissa had said the day before, every glance, every pause that hadn't made sense at the time but now fit together too perfectly. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I wasn't questioning anything anymore. I knew exactly what they were planning. And more importantly, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. The house greeted me the way it always had, quiet, familiar, filled with memories that no one else seemed to value the way I did. I set my purse down on the kitchen counter, the same spot I had used for decades, and stood there for a moment, letting the silence wrap around me. Then I did something simple. I made myself a cup of coffee. Not because I needed it, but because routine has a way of grounding you when everything else feels uncertain. I moved through the motions slowly, measuring, pouring, waiting, as if nothing had changed. Because on the surface, nothing had. Daniel still thought I was vulnerable. Melissa still believed I would follow their lead. And tomorrow, they would come back expecting me to sign those papers. I took my coffee to the dining table and sat down in the same chair I had been in when they first laid out their plan. The folder was still there, untouched, exactly where Daniel had left it. I opened it this time, not out of confusion, but out of clarity. Page after page, it was all there. Authorization forms. Property transfer language. Financial oversight clauses written in careful, legal terms designed to sound protective, but structured to take control. My control. My home. My accounts. My life. They hadn't come to help me transition. They had come to replace me. I closed the folder gently, aligning the edges as if it mattered, then rested my hand on top of it. For a brief moment, I let myself feel it, not the betrayal itself, but the weight of finally seeing it clearly. The years I had spent believing that love alone was enough to hold a family together. The quiet ways I had overlooked small things, dismissed them, explained them away. But clarity has a way of stripping everything down to its truth. And the truth was simple. They thought I was alone. They thought I was unprepared. They thought I would say yes. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest, and for the first time since Harold passed, I didn't feel like I was reacting to life. I felt like I was in control of it again. Tomorrow wasn't going to be the day they took everything from me. Tomorrow was going to be the day they realized they never could. The next morning arrived quietly, almost too quietly, like the world was holding its breath along with me. I woke up before sunrise, out of habit more than anything, and for a few seconds, I just lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the stillness of the house. This had always been the hour Harold and I shared, the soft hum of the coffee maker, the low murmur of morning news, the comfort of knowing someone else was there. But today felt different. Not heavier. Not sadder. Just sharper. Clearer. I got up, made my bed with the same care I always had, and walked into the kitchen, moving through each step of my routine like it mattered. Because it did. Every small, ordinary action reminded me of something important. This was still my life. My home. My choices. By the time the sun had fully risen, I was dressed, composed, and ready, not in the way they expected, but in a way they would never see coming. I didn't rush. I didn't pace. I simply prepared. I placed the folder Daniel had left neatly on the table, exactly where it had been yesterday, and beside it, I set a single sheet of paper I had printed that morning. Not dramatic. Not complicated. Just confirmation. The kind that doesn't need explanation. Then I sat down and waited. They arrived right on time. Of course they did. Melissa walked in first, her expression carefully arranged into something between concern and confidence, followed closely by Daniel, who gave me a quick, almost relieved smile when he saw me sitting calmly at the table. That smile told me everything. He thought I had accepted it. He thought the hardest part was already over. "Good morning, Mom," he said, setting his keys down. "We didn't want to overwhelm you yesterday, but we figured we could go through everything today," and I gestured lightly toward the chair across from me. "Sit," I said gently. He did. Melissa followed, placing her hand on his arm for just a moment, a silent signal between them that I now understood perfectly. Daniel opened the folder, flipping to the first page, already preparing to guide me through it. "It's all pretty straightforward," he began. "Once you sign, we can start the transition process, and within a few weeks." "Daniel," I interrupted softly. Not sharp. Not angry. Just enough to stop him. He looked up, slightly surprised. I slid the single sheet of paper across the table toward him, my movements slow, deliberate. "Before we go any further," I said, meeting his eyes for the first time without hesitation, "there's something you should read." He frowned slightly, confused, and picked it up. Melissa leaned closer, her expression tightening as her eyes scanned the page alongside his. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I simply sat there, hands folded in front of me, watching as the confidence they walked in with began to shift, subtly at first, then all at once. Because in that moment, they weren't looking at a brochure anymore. They weren't looking at a plan they had created. They were looking at something real. Something final. Something they hadn't anticipated. And for the first time since they stepped into my house, they were the ones trying to understand what was happening, while I already knew exactly how this was going to end. Daniel's eyes moved across the page once, then again, slower the second time, like his mind was struggling to catch up with what he was reading. The color drained from his face in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy caught doing something he knew he shouldn't have. Melissa leaned in closer, her hand tightening slightly on the edge of the table, her lips pressing into a thin line as her expression shifted from confidence to calculation. Neither of them spoke right away. They didn't know how to. And that silence, that was the moment everything changed. "What is this?" Daniel finally asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of the certainty he had walked in with. He looked up at me, searching my face for something, confusion, maybe, or hesitation. But I gave him neither. "It's confirmation," I said calmly. "A trust. $500,000. Moved yesterday morning." I paused just long enough for the words to settle before adding, "into Emily's name." Melissa straightened immediately, the shift in her posture sharp and unmistakable. "Emily," she repeated, unable to hide the edge in her voice. "Your daughter?" I nodded once. "Yes." Simple. Final. Daniel blinked, his grip tightening slightly on the paper. "Mom, why would you do that without talking to me?" The question might have sounded reasonable to anyone else. But to me, sitting there in my own home, it sounded like something else entirely. Like someone asking why they weren't included in a decision that was never theirs to make. I folded my hands together on the table, my voice steady, almost gentle. "The same reason you came here with paperwork already prepared," I said. "The same reason you brought someone to discuss where I should live without asking me first." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. No answer. Because there wasn't one that would hold up under the truth. Melissa tried instead. "We were thinking about your well-being," she said quickly. "This isn't about money." I let out a soft breath, not quite a laugh, but close enough to stop her. "Then you won't mind that it's no longer part of the conversation," I replied. That was when the tension in the room shifted completely. What had started as a carefully planned discussion had turned into something else, something they hadn't prepared for. Daniel looked back down at the paper, reading it again as if the words might change the second time. "You did this yesterday?" he asked. 24 hours ago," I confirmed. "Before you came back today." Melissa leaned back slightly. Now, her eyes narrowing just enough to show what she was really thinking beneath the surface. This wasn't just unexpected. It disrupted everything. The timeline. The plan. The outcome they had already imagined. And I could see it clearly, the moment they realized they weren't in control anymore. I reached over then, not to take the paper back, but to gently slide the folder they had brought toward them instead. "Now," I said softly, "if you still want to talk about what's best for me, we can start there." But the truth was, we both knew something had already ended at that table. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly and completely. Because in that moment, they weren't deciding my future anymore. They were reacting to a reality they hadn't seen coming. And for the first time since they walked through my door, they were the ones trying to catch up. Daniel pushed the paper back onto the table, but not all the way toward me, just far enough that it wasn't in his hands anymore, like it had suddenly become something he didn't want to be responsible for. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I hadn't seen in years, and let out a slow breath. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Why would you do something like this now?" I watched him carefully, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of clarity that only comes when there's nothing left to question. "It makes perfect sense," I said quietly. "I just didn't explain it to you first." Melissa leaned forward again, but this time her tone had changed. The softness was gone. What remained was something sharper, more urgent. "You're overreacting," she said. "We're trying to help you, and instead of working with us, you're making impulsive decisions about a large amount of money. That's exactly why we're concerned." Concern. The word almost sounded convincing, if I hadn't already seen everything behind it. I tilted my head slightly, studying her the way she had been studying me for weeks. Impulsive? I repeated gently. I had time to think. I had time to ask questions. That's more than I was given here. Daniel shifted in his seat again, clearly uncomfortable. Now, caught somewhere between the version of himself that wanted to believe he was doing the right thing and the reality unfolding in front of him. Mom, nobody's trying to take anything from you, he said, his voice softer, almost pleading now. We just don't want you to be alone in this house. It's not safe. And managing everything, it's a lot for anyone your age. There it was. Not cruel. Not harsh. But still rooted in the same assumption, that I was no longer capable of deciding what my life should look like. I let a small pause settle between us before I responded. I've been managing this house for over 30 years, I said. I managed it when your father was working nights. I managed it when you were a child and needed everything from me at once. And I'm managing it now. Melissa exhaled sharply, leaning back in her chair. This isn't about the past, she said. It's about what happens next. I nodded once. Exactly. The room went quiet again, but this time it wasn't uncertainty, it was tension. The kind that doesn't need raised voices to fill the space. Daniel looked down at the folder again, then back at me, as if trying to find a version of this conversation where he was still in control. But that version didn't exist anymore. I just wish you had talked to me, he said finally. I held his gaze, steady and calm. You mean the way you talked to me? I asked. Not accusing. Just honest. He didn't answer. And that silence said everything. I reached for the folder then, not to open it, but to close it fully, pressing it flat against the table with a quiet finality. You came here today with a plan, I said. So did I. Melissa's eyes narrowed slightly. What does that mean? I looked at her, then at Daniel, and for the first time, I didn't soften my words at all. It means, I said evenly, you don't get to decide what happens to me anymore. No raised voice. No dramatic gesture. Just a simple truth placed between us. And in that moment, I could see it clearly, the realization settling in, slow but undeniable. This wasn't going the way they expected. Not even close. Daniel didn't argue after that. Not right away. He just sat there, his hands resting on the edge of the table, fingers slightly curled like he wasn't sure what to do with them anymore. Melissa, on the other hand, wasn't as willing to let it settle. I could see it in the way she straightened her back, the way her eyes sharpened as she recalculated everything that had just happened. So that's it, she asked, her tone no longer softened by politeness. You're just going to shut us out? After everything we've tried to do for you? I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence stretch just enough to take the weight out of her words, to make it clear they didn't land the way she expected. Then I folded my hands gently in front of me. No, I said calmly. I'm not shutting you out. I'm setting a boundary. Daniel finally looked up at that, his expression conflicted, like he was standing between two versions of reality and didn't know which one to step into. Mom, it doesn't have to be like this, he said quietly. We can still figure something out together. Together. That word used to mean something. It used to mean long conversations at the kitchen table, decisions made with respect, not pressure. But now, hearing it in this context, it felt different. Hollow. I gave a small nod, acknowledging what he was trying to say, even if I didn't accept it. We could have, I replied. If you had come to me first. If you had trusted me enough to ask instead of decide. Melissa exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated now. We didn't decide anything, she insisted. We were trying to plan ahead. That's what responsible families do. I looked at her, steady and unflinching. Responsible families don't go behind each other's backs, I said. They don't ask about accounts they don't have access to. They don't bring paperwork for someone else to sign without a conversation. That landed. I could see it in the way Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly, the way he avoided my eyes again, not out of defiance this time, but something closer to recognition. Maybe even regret. But Melissa didn't look away. She held my gaze, her expression tight, controlled. "So what happens now?" she asked. I leaned back slightly in my chair, not to distance myself, but because I didn't need to lean forward anymore. I wasn't trying to convince them of anything. "Now," I said, my voice calm, grounded, "I stay here. In my home. I manage my own life, the way I always have. And if there comes a time when I need help, I'll ask for it." Daniel swallowed, nodding slowly, like he was absorbing something he hadn't expected to learn today. "And the trust?" he asked quietly. I met his eyes, not unkindly, but without hesitation. "The trust stays exactly where I put it." Another silence followed, but this one felt different. Not tense. Not uncertain. Just final. Daniel stood up first, slower than before, like the weight of the room had shifted onto him in a way he hadn't prepared for. Melissa followed a moment later, her movements controlled but tighter than when she arrived. They didn't argue again. There was nothing left to argue with. At the door, Daniel paused, his hand on the knob, then glanced back at me. For a brief second, I saw something familiar in his eyes, something softer, something that reminded me of who he used to be. But he didn't say anything. He just nodded once and walked out. And just like that, they were gone. Not in anger. Not in a storm of words. Just gone. I sat there for a moment longer, listening to the quiet settle back into the house. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt like something had been cleared away. Something unnecessary. Something that had been weighing on me without me even realizing it. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for the next conversation. I wasn't bracing for what might happen. I was simply at peace with what already had. That evening, after the door had closed and the sound of their car faded down the street, I didn't move right away. I stayed in my chair at the dining table, my hands resting gently in front of me, just listening, to the quiet, to the steady rhythm of the clock on the wall, to the absence of tension that had filled this room just hours before. It wasn't the kind of silence that feels empty. It was the kind that feels earned. I stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen, rinsing my cup and placing it carefully in the rack, just like I had done thousands of times before. The motions were familiar, grounding. Life hadn't changed in the ways they expected it to, but it had changed in the ways that mattered. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I wasn't second-guessing my instincts. I wasn't explaining my choices to people who had already made theirs without me. Later, I stepped out onto the back porch, the evening air cool against my skin, carrying the faint scent of the garden herald I had planted all those years ago. The roses were just beginning to bloom again, stubborn and beautiful, exactly on their own time. I smiled at that. He used to say they were like me, quiet, but stronger than they looked. Back then, I thought he was just being kind. Now, I understood what he meant. I thought about Daniel, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of clarity that no longer hurt. He had made his choices. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of influence, maybe because somewhere along the way, he started seeing me as someone who needed to be managed instead of respected. And Melissa, she had simply acted on what she believed she could control. But control only works when it's given. And I had taken mine back. Quietly. Completely. Inside, on the dining table, the folder they brought still sat where I had left it, closed, untouched, irrelevant. Next to it, the confirmation of the trust was no longer just a document. It was a line. A boundary. A decision made not out of spite, but out of understanding. Because in the end, this was never really about the money. It was about dignity. About being seen. About choosing where my life would go even now. Especially now. The next morning, I called Emily. We hadn't spoken in a while, not because of conflict, but because life has a way of creating distance where there shouldn't be any. She answered on the second ring, her voice surprised but warm. We talked longer than we had in years. Not about the trust. Not about Daniel. Just about life. And for the first time in a long time, it felt simple again. Honest. Real. As I hung up the phone, I looked around my home, the same walls, the same light pouring through the windows, the same quiet that had once felt heavy but now felt like peace. I didn't know what the future would bring. None of us ever do. But I knew this much, whatever came next would be on my terms. They thought I was weak. They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought they had time. But they were wrong. They were 24 hours too late.